Why did some societies conquer others? Why did Europeans end up colonizing much of the world instead of the other way around? Why do some regions seem to advance faster, while others remain stuck in cycles of poverty and instability? These questions are uncomfortable. And for a long time, humanity answered them in very simple and very dangerous ways. People said it was because some races were smarter. Some cultures were more hardworking. Some civilizations were simply better. But Jared Diamond begins his work by rejecting all of that. He asks us to pause and reconsider something fundamental. What if the story of human inequality is not about intelligence, morality, or destiny, but about geography, environment, and chance? This idea alone quietly dismantles centuries of assumptions. For most of human history, all humans lived the same way. We were hunter-gatherers. Small groups. Limited possessions. Deep dependence on nature. There were no kings. No empires. No advanced weapons. No written language. And most importantly, no clear winners. If you went back tens of thousands of years, no one could have predicted which group would dominate the planet. The people living in Europe were not more advanced than those in Africa, Australia, or the Americas. They were simply human beings, surviving day to day. So the question becomes sharper. Backhand index pointing right, what changed? Diamond argues that the turning point was not culture or genetics, but food. Specifically, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture. This shift did not happen everywhere at the same time. And it did not happen everywhere with the same tools. Some regions were accidentally blessed with plants that were easy to domesticate. Plants that grew fast, produced lots of calories, and could be stored. Wheat, barley, rice. This difference seems small at first, but its consequences were enormous. Diamond's core argument is unsettling because it removes human ego from the center of history. He does not begin with heroes, kings, or ideas. He begins with geography. Not geography as maps and borders, but geography as environment, ecology, and luck. One of the most radical shifts this book makes is changing the order of cause and effect. Most historical narratives work like this. Humans invent ideas. Ideas create technologies. Technology shapes societies. Diamond flips the chain. He argues, environment shapes food production. Food production shapes population size. Population size shapes technology, specialization, and power. In this view, ideas do not come first. Survival does. Before a society can build philosophy, art, or science, it must answer one basic question every single day. How do we reliably feed ourselves? This single constraint, food, quietly determines everything else. Some regions of the world were rich in plants that could be domesticated. Others were not. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, these crops did not appear everywhere. They emerged in very specific ecological zones. And once humans discovered that they could control these plants, something irreversible happened. Agriculture created food surplus. Food surplus meant people no longer had to spend all day finding food. Some people could specialize. Specialists could become toolmakers, leaders, soldiers, priests. This is where inequality begins, not morally, but structurally. Societies with agriculture could grow dense populations. Dense populations meant more ideas exchanged, more innovations tested, and more resistance to collapse. Societies without agriculture remained small and mobile. Not because they were incapable, but because their environments did not allow stable food production at scale. This difference compounds over centuries. Plants were only half the story. The other half was animals. Very few large animals on Earth are suitable for domestication. Most are too aggressive, too nervous, too slow-growing, or too unpredictable. By sheer coincidence, Eurasia happened to have most of them. Cows, horses, sheep, goats, pigs, these animals provided meat and milk, labor and transportation, fertilizer, military advantage. But they also brought something far more consequential. They brought germs. Living closely with animals exposed humans to new diseases. Over generations, Eurasian societies developed partial immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens. These diseases were deadly, but survivable enough to persist. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they did not just bring weapons. They brought microbes that Native American populations had never encountered. The result was catastrophic. Entire civilizations collapsed before large-scale battles even occurred. In many regions, disease killed more people than conquest. Diamond emphasizes something uncomfortable here. This was not intentional genocide in most cases. It was biological asymmetry. Germs acted as unplanned allies of conquest. History was not just shaped by swords and guns, but by immune systems. Another key insight is about direction, not intelligence. Eurasia stretches largely east to west. The Americas and Africa stretch north to south. This matters more than it sounds. Crops, animals, and technologies spread more easily across similar climates. East-west diffusion allowed farming methods, tools, and ideas to travel quickly across Eurasia. In contrast, north-south continents forced societies to adapt to drastic changes in climate, day length, and seasons. Technologies spread slowly, or not at all. So while one region accumulated innovations layer by layer, another had to reinvent them repeatedly under different conditions. Progress wasn't faster because people were smarter. It was faster because the land cooperated. One of the most important aspects of Diamond's work is what it refuses to do. It does not praise conquerors. It does not blame the conquered. It does not argue superiority. Instead, it treats human societies as systems under constraints. Given a certain environment, certain outcomes become more likely. Not guaranteed, but statistically favored. This reframing changes how we see history. If power emerged from geography rather than virtue, then dominance loses its moral justification. And if collapse came from circumstance rather than failure, then victimhood loses its shame. History becomes less about who deserved what, and more about how conditions accumulate over time. Diamond's argument quietly dismantles another assumption, that technological progress is natural and unstoppable. In reality, progress is fragile. It depends on stable food systems, population density, knowledge transmission, environmental balance. Remove one element, and entire civilizations can stagnate or collapse. This is not ancient history only. The same mechanisms still operate today. Modern societies feel invincible, but they are built on the same dependencies: energy, food, climate, and systems too complex to fully control. By the end of this first layer, a subtle shift happens. History stops feeling like a story of winners and losers. It starts feeling like a story of paths. Paths shaped by soil, climate, animals, and accidents long before anyone made conscious choices. This perspective doesn't erase human agency, but it humbles it. It suggests that much of what we call destiny was inherited terrain. Once food surplus appears, something subtle but irreversible begins. People stop doing the same work. In small hunter-gatherer groups, almost everyone knows how to do almost everything. Hunting, gathering, toolmaking, childcare, decision-making, skills are shared because survival demands flexibility. If one person fails, the group adapts. But agriculture changes this balance. When food becomes predictable, societies can afford specialization. Some people farm. Others store grain. Others make tools. Others organize labor. Others plan defense. At first, this seems efficient. And it is. But specialization does something deeper. It creates dependency. A farmer depends on the toolmaker. The toolmaker depends on the farmer. The organizer depends on both. And gradually, coordination becomes power. Those who control food storage, distribution, and organization gain leverage over those who produce it. Leadership becomes formal. Hierarchy becomes stable. Inequality becomes normalized. Not because people suddenly became greedy, but because large systems require management. This is how chiefs become kings and villages become states. Writing enters the story here, not as a cultural luxury, but as a logistical necessity. As societies grow larger, memory is no longer enough. You need records. You need accounting. You need contracts, taxes, laws, and archives. Writing is not born from poetry, it is born from bureaucracy. The earliest writing systems were not stories. They were lists. Grain counts. Land ownership. Labor obligations. Writing locks power into permanence. What was once negotiable becomes written. What was once flexible becomes law. And law, once established, tends to protect those who write it. This is how inequality survives generations. As states expand, conflict becomes organized. Small groups fight for territory when necessary, but large societies fight for resources, labor, and control. Warfare becomes professionalized. Soldiers train full-time because food surplus allows it. Technology now accelerates unevenly. Metallurgy emerges where ores are accessible. Weapons improve where conflict is constant. Armor evolves where states can afford it. And again, environment quietly selects winners. Regions with access to metals, fuel, and trade routes develop faster military technology. Regions without them may be equally intelligent, equally brave, but materially disadvantaged. This matters because once a technological gap appears, it tends to widen. A society with steel weapons defeats one without. Victory brings resources. Resources fund more innovation. The loop reinforces itself. By the time two societies meet, the outcome often feels pre-decided, not because of destiny, but because of accumulated advantages stretching back thousands of years. Another quiet force enters here: epidemics. As populations grow denser, diseases spread more easily. This is a cost of civilization. Cities are breeding grounds for pathogens. But over time, repeated exposure builds immunity. Survivors pass on resistance. Populations adapt. This adaptation is slow and brutal, but once established, it becomes a hidden shield. When societies with long histories of dense living encounter societies without it, the biological imbalance is devastating. This is why conquest often looked effortless in historical records. The real battle happened before soldiers arrived. Disease collapses social order. Leaders die. Knowledge disappears. Fear spreads faster than any army. By the time invaders fight, they face a society already weakened. This is not moral superiority. It is immunological history. Diamond makes an important clarification here. He does not claim that agriculture made humans happier. In fact, evidence suggests the opposite. Early farmers worked longer hours than hunter-gatherers. Their diets were less diverse. Their bodies showed more signs of disease and malnutrition. So why did agriculture spread? Because it supported more people, not better lives. When populations grow, they outcompete smaller groups even if individuals suffer more. This is one of the book's most uncomfortable truths. History often favors systems that expand, not systems that optimize well-being. Once farming spreads, going back becomes almost impossible. Population density rises beyond what hunting and gathering can support. Choice disappears. What began as an option becomes a trap. As states grow larger, they need unifying ideas. People must believe in the system that governs them, even if it disadvantages them. This is where shared myths, religions, and ideologies emerge as tools of cohesion. Not lies, but collective beliefs. Beliefs that explain why the social order exists. Why some rule and others obey. Why inequality is natural, necessary, or sacred. These belief systems are powerful because they feel meaningful. They give people identity, purpose, and belonging. But they also stabilize hierarchy. Once people internalize the logic of the system, force becomes less necessary. Control shifts from physical domination to psychological acceptance. This is how empires persist. Technology continues to accelerate, not linearly, but unevenly. In some regions, innovation stacks rapidly because populations are large, connected, and competitive. Ideas spread, improve, and recombine. In isolated regions, innovation may appear and disappear repeatedly, never compounding. Diamond stresses that this has nothing to do with creativity or intelligence. Innovation is not just about having ideas, it's about keeping them alive. Large, interconnected societies act as memory systems. Even if one inventor fails, another may succeed. Knowledge survives individuals. Small, isolated groups cannot afford such losses. When a skilled toolmaker dies, knowledge can vanish entirely. Scale protects progress. This explains a pattern seen again and again in history. Why some technologies appear early in one place and never elsewhere. Why some societies stagnate despite capability. Why chance discoveries matter less than systems that preserve them. History rewards redundancy. As centuries pass, these differences solidify. States become empires. Empires control trade. Trade spreads power asymmetrically. By the time global contact intensifies, inequality is no longer local, it is planetary. And yet, when we tell this story, we often reverse cause and effect. We say some societies conquered because they were advanced. But they were advanced because they had conquered, success feeding success. Diamond's framework strips away this circular logic. It shows that advantage is often inherited, not earned. Diamond's core argument is unsettling because it removes human ego from the center of history. He does not begin with heroes, kings, or ideas. He begins with geography. Not geography as maps and borders, but geography as environment, ecology, and luck. One of the most radical shifts this book makes is changing the order of cause and effect. Most historical narratives work like this. Humans invent ideas. Ideas create technologies. Technologies shape societies. Diamond flips the chain. He argues, environment shapes food production. Food production shapes population size. Population size shapes technology, specialization, and power. In this view, ideas do not come first. Survival does. Before a society can build philosophy, art, or science, it must answer one basic question every single day. How do we reliably feed ourselves? This single constraint, food, quietly determines everything else. Once we stop seeing history as a moral contest and start seeing it as a system under pressure, a new question emerges. If geography and environment shape the past so powerfully, why do modern societies still believe they have escaped those limits? Technology gives the illusion of independence. Machines replace muscles. Global trade replaces local scarcity. Medicine pushes back disease. Information moves faster than any army ever could. It feels like we have outgrown the constraints that once ruled human destiny. But Diamond's framework suggests something more troubling. We didn't escape the system. We scaled it up. Modern civilization still rests on surplus, just larger, more complex, and more fragile than before. Food now travels thousands of miles. Energy comes from ancient sunlight stored in fossil fuels. Supply chains stretch across continents. This creates efficiency, but also dependence. When systems are small, failure is local. When systems are global, failure is systemic. History teaches that complexity increases productivity, but also vulnerability. One of the most dangerous myths modern societies hold is the belief that collapse only happens to primitive or unadvanced civilizations. But history shows the opposite. The societies most at risk are often the most complex. They depend on precise coordination. They require constant energy input. They assume stability as a baseline. When disruption occurs, climate shifts, disease outbreaks, resource shortages, the cost of failure is higher, not lower. Past civilizations collapsed not because people were ignorant, but because systems outgrew their environments. The Maya did not forget how to farm. The Romans did not lose intelligence. The inhabitants of Easter Island did not suddenly become careless. They pushed systems to their limits until the limits pushed back. Diamond's argument forces us to confront an uncomfortable continuity. Environmental determinism did not end with the ancient world. It simply became harder to see. Modern nations still benefit from geographic luck, access to navigable rivers, fertile land, temperate climates, and energy resources. These advantages compound economically, just as they once did agriculturally. Meanwhile, regions facing poor soil, harsh climates, or historical disruption struggle to escape cycles of instability, not because of cultural failure, but because starting conditions matter. This reframes global inequality. Aid, development, and policy debates often assume a level playing field distorted by poor decisions. Diamond's lens suggests the field was never level to begin with. Some societies began the race thousands of years ahead, not because they ran faster, but because the track favored them. This perspective is unsettling because it limits the role of individual merit in large-scale outcomes. We like stories where success is earned and failure is deserved. They give meaning to effort and justify hierarchy. But history at scale does not reward virtue. It rewards compatibility with environment. This does not mean human choices don't matter. They do, immensely. But they operate within boundaries. You can make brilliant decisions inside a collapsing system and still fail. You can make mediocre decisions inside a favorable system and still succeed. This tension is hard to accept because it undermines moral simplicity. Another modern echo appears in how innovation spreads today. We assume good ideas naturally rise to the top. But just like ancient technologies, modern innovations depend on networks, infrastructure, and preservation. A breakthrough in isolation dies quietly. A mediocre idea in a powerful network can dominate the world. This is why technological leadership clusters geographically. Why certain regions produce waves of innovation while others consume them. Why access, not intelligence, predicts influence. Scale still protects progress. Diamond also challenges how we think about culture. Culture is often treated as an independent force, something that explains why societies behave the way they do. But in this framework, culture is often a response, not a cause. Beliefs form around survival strategies. Values stabilize successful systems. Traditions preserve adaptations that worked. What looks like cultural preference may be environmental necessity fossilized into identity. This doesn't make culture fake. It makes it functional. And once conditions change, cultures can lag behind the realities they were built for. This is where friction begins. One of the most important insights here is about timescales. Human psychology evolved for short-term survival. Civilizations operate on centuries. Environmental consequences unfold over millennia. These layers rarely align. A decision that benefits a society for one generation may harm it over 10. A practice that sustains power now may undermine stability later. History is filled with systems that optimized locally and collapsed globally. The danger is not ignorance, it's delayed feedback. At this point, the book stops feeling like history and starts feeling like diagnosis. If ancient inequalities emerged from food, germs, and geography, then modern inequalities emerge from energy, technology, and systems too large to intuit. The variables changed. The structure did not. We still depend on surplus. We still concentrate power. We still expand until limits appear. The difference is speed. What once unfolded over centuries now unfolds over decades. This perspective does something rare. It removes both pride and shame from history. It says, your ancestors did not win because they were better. Your ancestors did not lose because they were worse. They inherited conditions and adapted as best they could. Understanding this does not weaken responsibility. It deepens it. Because if outcomes are not guaranteed by virtue, then preserving stability requires awareness, not arrogance. The final implication is perhaps the most important. If geography shaped history unconsciously, modern societies, aware of these forces, no longer have ignorance as an excuse. We understand environmental limits now. We understand systemic risk. We understand feedback loops, which means future outcomes will reflect not just circumstance, but choice. History explains how we arrived here. It does not promise we will stay. Once we accept that history is shaped less by intention and more by accumulated conditions, the idea of progress itself becomes unstable. We tend to imagine progress as a straight line, each generation smarter, richer, more capable than the last. But Diamond's framework suggests something closer to a curve that rises, plateaus, and sometimes collapses. Progress is not guaranteed. It is conditional. Every advancement solves one problem while creating others. Agriculture feeds more people but spreads disease. Cities generate knowledge but concentrate risk. Technology increases efficiency but deepens dependence. Civilization is a trade-off engine. What matters is not whether progress exists, but whether its costs remain invisible long enough to become irreversible. One reason modern societies feel confident is that consequences are delayed. Environmental damage accumulates slowly. Resource depletion hides behind markets. Social inequality grows quietly until it hardens into structure. By the time the effects become obvious, systems are too large to adjust easily. This pattern appears repeatedly in history. Short-term success masks long-term fragility. Complexity delays feedback. Power resists change. Collapse rarely arrives as a single event. It arrives as erosion. Diamond's work also reframes the idea of fairness. If historical advantage is inherited rather than earned, then moral judgments about success become questionable. This does not erase personal effort, but it places effort inside context. Two people can work equally hard and reach wildly different outcomes because the systems they operate within amplify or suppress their actions. The same applies to societies. This understanding complicates narratives of blame. It also complicates narratives of pride. Power feels deserved when its origins are forgotten. Another uncomfortable implication emerges here. If inequality is structurally produced, then simply changing leadership or ideology does not automatically fix it. Systems recreate outcomes regardless of intent. Good people inside broken systems still produce harm. Bad people inside functional systems can still produce stability. This is why revolutions often fail to deliver equality. They change symbols, not structures. Diamond's framework suggests that lasting change requires altering underlying conditions, resources, access, environment, and incentives, not just beliefs. The book also quietly challenges the idea of human exceptionalism. We like to believe that intelligence sets us apart from nature. But history shows humans responding to environmental pressures much like any other species. We adapt. We expand. We overshoot. The difference is scale. Humans can alter their environments faster than they can biologically adapt to the consequences. This mismatch creates risk. Ancient societies modified landscapes locally. Modern societies modify them globally. The feedback loop is no longer regional, it is planetary. This leads to a shift in responsibility. If past societies were unaware of long-term consequences, modern societies are not. We know about climate systems. We understand disease dynamics. We track resource flows. Ignorance no longer explains failure. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable, but it means prevention requires humility. The same forces that produce past dominance, surplus, scale, specialization, can produce future instability if unmanaged. Diamond never presents history as a warning sermon, but the implications are hard to ignore. The story of guns, germs, and steel is not just about why some societies conquered others. It is about how advantages compound, how systems lock in outcomes, and how power emerges without intention. Once these forces are visible, it becomes harder to believe in simple explanations for complex outcomes. There is a final shift that happens when you fully absorb this framework. You stop asking, who is better? And start asking, what conditions produce stability? This question changes everything. It moves the focus from judgment to design, from blame to prevention, from pride to responsibility. When history is understood as a product of systems rather than virtues, something subtle changes in how we think about responsibility. At first, it feels like agency disappears. If geography, food, germs, and scale shaped outcomes long before anyone made conscious choices, then what room is left for individual action? But Diamond's framework does not remove agency. It relocates it. Agency no longer lives in heroic domination. It lives in awareness of constraints. Once we understand the forces that quietly guide outcomes, we gain the ability to work with them or against them intentionally. This is the difference between being carried by history and steering within it. Education looks different through this lens. Instead of teaching history as a sequence of leaders, wars, and dates, it becomes a study of patterns. Patterns of resource use. Patterns of expansion and overshoot. Patterns of inequality hardening into structure. This kind of understanding does not produce pride. It produces caution. It teaches that success is fragile, not permanent. That stability is maintained, not inherited. That systems require care, not faith. Politics also changes meaning here. Debates often focus on ideology, morality, and intention. But Diamond's work suggests that policies succeed or fail less because of beliefs and more because of alignment with material realities. You cannot legislate away environmental limits. You cannot moralize food scarcity. You cannot will systems into balance through rhetoric alone. This does not make politics meaningless. It makes it grounded. Effective governance becomes the art of managing constraints rather than denying them. At the individual level, this perspective can feel uncomfortable. We prefer stories where effort guarantees reward, where success proves worth, where failure implies fault. But history at scale resists this simplicity. Understanding this does not require abandoning ambition or responsibility. It requires abandoning arrogance. You can strive without assuming superiority. You can succeed without assuming entitlement. You can fail without assuming inadequacy. This is a quieter, more stable form of meaning. Another shift happens in how we view other societies. If inequality is historically produced rather than culturally deserved, then comparison loses its moral edge. Different societies are not earlier or later versions of the same path. They are responses to different starting conditions. This challenges the idea that modernization must look the same everywhere. It also challenges the belief that one model fits all. Development, in this framework, is not imitation. It is adaptation. There is also a warning embedded here. Once societies become powerful, they often mistake their advantages for proof of correctness. They universalize their systems. They export them without regard for local conditions. History shows this rarely ends well. What works in one environment may fail catastrophically in another. What scales in one context may destabilize another. Power tends to forget its origins. Diamond's argument, taken seriously, calls for a different kind of humility. Not the humility of self-doubt, but the humility of systems thinking. It recognizes that no society stands outside nature, that no technology fully cancels dependency, that no progress is immune to limits. This humility is not pessimistic. It is stabilizing. The deeper message is not that collapse is inevitable, but that blindness is dangerous. Past societies did not fall because they were doomed. They fell because they misunderstood their own success. They expanded until expansion itself became the threat. Modern societies face the same temptation, only faster, larger, and more interconnected. At this stage, the book stops offering explanations and starts offering perspective. It does not tell us what to do. It tells us how to see. And seeing clearly may be the most powerful advantage of all. When people first encounter this way of thinking, a quiet fear often follows. If success is not proof of virtue, and failure is not proof of weakness, then what motivates effort? If history is shaped by systems larger than individuals, then why try at all? This reaction is natural, but it misunderstands the role of meaning. Meaning does not disappear when myths collapse. It relocates. Instead of being rooted in domination or comparison, meaning shifts towards stewardship. You are not responsible for creating the world you inherit. You are responsible for how you manage it. This is a heavier responsibility, but also a more honest one. Diamond's framework does not ask individuals to feel guilty for historical advantage, nor ashamed of historical loss. It asks for clarity. Clarity about where advantages come from. Clarity about how fragile they are. Clarity about how easily they can be misused. This clarity is what allows societies to avoid repeating the same cycles under new names. Hope, in this context, is not blind optimism. It is conditional confidence. Confidence that systems can be adjusted if they are understood early enough. Confidence that awareness can slow destructive momentum. Confidence that humans can learn, sometimes painfully, from pattern recognition. History shows that adaptation is possible. But it also shows that adaptation is rare when power resists restraint. The future depends less on intelligence than on restraint. Another shift occurs when we stop romanticizing either the past or the future. The past was not noble simplicity. The future is not guaranteed salvation. Both are shaped by trade-offs. Technological solutions solve problems, but they also redistribute risk. Environmental interventions stabilize systems, but they create dependencies. Global coordination increases resilience, but it amplifies failure. There is no final solution, only continuous management. This is not a flaw. It is the cost of complexity. Diamond's work ultimately argues for a form of realism that sits between cynicism and idealism. Cynicism says collapse is inevitable, so nothing matters. Idealism says progress is natural, so nothing can go wrong. History rejects both. Collapse happens, but not always. Progress happens, but not automatically. What matters is alignment. Alignment between population and resources. Alignment between technology and environment. Alignment between power and responsibility. When these alignments drift too far apart, systems strain. The danger is not change itself. The danger is denial. At the deepest level, this framework changes how we relate to time. Instead of seeing ourselves as the climax of history, we see ourselves as one phase in an ongoing process. This reduces arrogance, but it also reduces despair. If past collapses did not end humanity, future crises will not either. But they will reshape systems. The question is not whether change will come. It is whether change will be navigated or endured. Meaning, then, comes from participation rather than victory. From contributing to stability rather than assuming permanence. From improving alignment rather than maximizing dominance. This is quieter than heroic narratives. But it is more sustainable. By now, the central lesson has fully emerged. Tons, germs, and steel were not causes in isolation. They were expressions of deeper structures. Structures built from land, food, animals, scale, and time. Understanding those structures does not make us powerless. It makes us responsible. When all the layers are placed together, the story no longer feels like an explanation of conquest. It feels like a map. Not a map of nations or borders, but a map of forces, quiet, persistent pressures that shape outcomes whether we acknowledge them or not. Food production creates surplus. Surplus creates population growth. Population growth creates specialization. Specialization creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates power. And power, once established, reshapes the environment that produced it. This loop has repeated itself across continents, centuries, and cultures. Names change. Technologies change. The structure remains. What makes this framework unsettling is that it removes the comfort of finality. There is no endpoint where history resolves into justice, equality, or stability forever. There are only phases of balance and imbalance. Societies that understand this remain flexible. Societies that deny it become brittle. Brittleness is the real enemy of civilization. One of the most misleading ideas humans hold is that control equals safety. The more complex a system becomes, the more control it appears to offer. But complexity often hides fragility. When everything works, it feels invincible. When one part fails, everything feels exposed. Ancient societies experienced this locally. Modern societies experience it globally. This is why small disruptions now create large effects. It is not weakness, it is interdependence. The lesson here is not to fear complexity, but to respect it. Complex systems require humility. They punish overconfidence. They demand constant adjustment. History's greatest collapses were not caused by ignorance alone, but by the refusal to reconsider success. The moment a system believes it has escaped limits is the moment limits reassert themselves. At this point, the narrative turns inward. If none of us chose the conditions we inherited, then moral energy is better spent on maintenance than judgment. Maintenance of ecosystems. Maintenance of institutions. Maintenance of social trust. These are not dramatic acts. They do not create legends, but they prevent disasters. Understanding history this way also softens how we see one another. Success becomes less about worth and more about circumstance. Failure becomes less about blame and more about constraint. This does not remove accountability. It removes cruelty. It allows cooperation to replace comparison. The most powerful outcome of Diamond's work is not knowledge, it is perspective. Perspective that stretches beyond lifetimes. Perspective that connects soil to cities. Perspective that links invisible microbes to global empires. Once you see these connections, it becomes impossible to believe in simple explanations again. And that is a gift. Because simple explanations create enemies. Complex understanding creates responsibility. History did not reward some societies because they were chosen. It rewarded them because conditions aligned temporarily. Those alignments can change. They always do. The question is not whether history will continue to shape us. It is whether we will recognize the forces shaping it while there is still time to respond.